Okay, in this video, I'd like to talk about the new MH370 footage that's just come out from satellites showing thermal and all kinds of different views of this thing. They actually show this thing disappearing and basically the wormhole that it gets sucked into. So this is everything that I've been telling you in my previous video over a year ago that I made titled MH370 was jumped into hyperspace and you'll never find it. I have proof. So in that video, I talk about what I witnessed 1 year prior to the disappearance of that plane. And what they were doing here in northern Michigan was, this went on for either 2 or 3 days. And because the thing that you could hear was just jets flying nonstop in the area, and their engines were just going, it sounded like they were just doing dives, and then they were climbing and then doing dives. It was just, you could hear their engine, it's unmistakable. So basically I was walking the dog down the road and observed this. What they were doing was, you would see a jet, it would be overhead, and then all of a sudden you'd hear everything, and then you wouldn't hear anything, and the jet would disappear, and it would be miles away over Lake Huron. It would reappear, and you'd hear the sound again. And they just kept doing this on a constant loop, jumping the jet, and the jet would always jump right about the same spot, and it always jumped to about the same spot. So this was really interesting. I tried to videotape it, but they were at such high altitude that you couldn't, and the planes were all white, so you couldn't really see them. So this was observed for at least 2 days when they were doing this. And then the thing disappeared, and the only thing that actually clued me into tying this whole thing into that plane was the noise of the engines. And that's what set me off on this whole thing. So let's get into it. I haven't made any videos for a while. I've been super busy here, and I switched phones, and thanks everybody that's watched my channel. I appreciate it. I'm going to try to make some more. And everybody that's asked about me, thank you. You've been very kind. So I'll show you what I figured out here. And check out this this nice snow sphere that's appeared on my pond this morning. I think it's a sign to make this video. It's like a white hole. So what's going on here is, they're always talking about duality, but this is where they fool you. Duality is an illusion, because everything is triplicate, just like the triangle. So you don't have just two conditions going on like they're always telling you. You got space, you got counter space, and you have a 0 point in between. It's basically like you would have a white hole, a black hole, and an event horizon. There's always 3 things going on, and they trick you with this duality stuff, so don't be fooled. Okay, so what this is an AC sine wave here. And an AC sine wave, it always fluctuates. It's always in a constant state of flux. So it's always going from positive, dipping through the 0 point and going to negative, back up to positive, dipping through the 0 point to a negative and coming back up. So it's always doing this. It's in a constant state of flux. To where DC would be the complete opposite. DC would just be a complete straight line, like longitudinal, or this would be called a transverse wave. So something transversing would take longer in time to reach the end here, opposed to something that would be straight longitudinal to the point. It would be almost instant. So this is what we're dealing with. This is electromagnetism here. This is the wave that it makes. And since it makes this sine wave, it's slower than what the dielectricity is. So basically you have 2 things. In space, you have electromagnetism. In counter space, you have dielectricity. These are 2 opposing things. This is where the duality does come in, and this is where the mirror effect comes in. Okay, so an AC sine wave, its opposite would be not having a sine wave function at all. So instead of the AC sine wave fluctuating in a constant state of flux, the DC or scalar would have no wave function. It's a longitudinal propagation, faster than light. So this is going at 186,000 miles per second, where this is almost instantaneous. It's faster than light. So in magnetism, this is where you would also have matter, because the magnetism is what is binding all the subatomic hydrogen together to form solid matter. Okay, on the flip side in counter space, because you only have two dimensions to work with, you have space and counter space. But there's always a zero line in between, to where it flips from a white hole to a black hole. So in counter space, you would have the opposite of space. You would have, instead of matter, you'd have antimatter. Counter space could actually be called the ether, or whatever you want to call it, as far as hyperspace, or there's 1,000 different names for it. So what they're doing is they're actually making the MH370 plane, instead of doing the sine wave, they're making the actual plane do something like this, and this is called the transient. So where these waves, there's spikes, but it's not an actual wave. So this is what I mean. Okay, so when the plane is going up and down, it's causing something called a transient current. It's actually making this in the ether. And when you get into these super spikes or impulses, this is where you start dealing with phenomenon that's almost DC. It's constant. It's not in a constant state of change where AC is. Okay, so just to give you an idea, a transient current is an oscillatory or aperiodic current that flows in a circuit for a short time following an electromagnetic disturbance, like a nearby lightning strike. Well, a nearby lightning strike is actually a dielectric discharge. Okay, so because everything discharges in the counter space, so it's coming from space, but it's always dumping into counter space, and then it just keeps replenishing the whole deal. So what Eric Dollard is talking about in History and Theory of Electricity on YouTube, he says that Steinmetz and Alexanderson had come up with a way to get around all the Tesla and Marconi patents for radio. Okay, so the Alexanderson system had this big antenna field in Belenes, California, and they were grounded to these huge plates in the ocean, and it's basically an Earth-based transmission system is how they did this. So they're using an electric structure known as scalar, where there's no variation in space. Here's an example. If there's 100,000 volts at one antenna, the time equals 0, so there's no time delay. There will be 100,000 volts at the other end, no less. It neutralizes the velocity. The velocity in an Alexanderson system has no relationship to the velocity of light. They're two different things. So infinite velocity and the velocity of light are two polar opposites or zeros in the system, like nodal points, where it crosses from one state to another. So that's how the jet can be in space at one point and then jump to the other dimension of counter space, because you only have two dimensions to work with. String theory, all that stuff is completely wrong. It's just a way to throw you off the track. So basically they took the Alexanderson system to the point where if they had one antenna in California, they could have another antenna in New York, and once they were both powered up, Dollar says that you could be standing in under the antenna in California and simultaneously still be standing under the antenna that's in New York. But they didn't really develop it that far. So the antenna has no velocity, so it's not affected by electromagnetic waves on the surface, which have velocity and gives a true reading from the ground. Electricity will disappear and reappear in another location. So that's how they jumped the plane. They disappeared it from space, visible light spectrum, into the non-visible counter space, and they could have teleported it somewhere, or they just could have left it keep going and going and going. So the DC, like I said, is constant. It's straight longitudinal, where the AC is in a constant state of change. So magnetic and dielectric fields have stored energy, and if it has nowhere to go, it will blast. So that's what you see in the video. That big blast that occurred, that's how they got the jump. So basically, you're creating your black hole to be sucked into. So a transient current or impulse current are wave spikes. And you can see how they're sharp compared to an AC wave. Exponential form here. So the energy starts in an oscillation sine wave and is compounded with a dampening wave and produces oscillating currents. These currents no longer have frequencies in a conventional sense. This is where they're talking about an AC sine wave having frequency, and then you have no more wave function. Okay, so DC has no frequency, where AC has a constant frequency like an RPM or cycles per second. The impulse, which is what these are, they're pulses. The impulse is an imaginary frequency, and it's measured in decibels per second. So Tesla's monopolar system is using the square root of 1, or he's dividing the square root of 1, which equals 1. So he came up with the electrical device where you could connect to the earth using only a positive and no negatives. So it's like a big Jacob's ladder, to where you take 2 ground rods and you space them, and then you connect a battery, and most electricity goes between the ground rods. So the problem is, how do you transmit into the earth and not have the power go between the ground rods? And this is where the idea of counter space comes from. So you have 2 dimensions, and electricity is a 4-pole situation that never exists in less than 2 dimensions at once. So electricity is always in space and it's always in counter space simultaneously. Okay, there is no electricity unless you have magnetism and dielectricity. These are the 2 components. This is where they threw everybody off with the electron. We're going to get into another video with that. So there is no electricity unless you have magnetism and dielectricity. Until the 2 are united in a geometric formation, you do not have electricity. So they threw everybody on the electron curve. Most people bought it, but Tesla and Steinmetz kept telling everybody that they're missing the whole point. So, like I said, what they're doing when they're throttling those engines up and then they're going climbing and then they're diving, they're actually creating that transient using the plane. And the air has a K dielectric value of 1, meaning that it's conductive. So the higher up that you go, the more conductive that the air will get. And that's how they're doing it. That's how they're jumping this thing. And so they're taking this plane from visible light and they're jumping it into the dielectric. So the dielectric is nothing but an insulator. And then this would be your hot, your positive. This would be your cool. So it's just a complete mirror opposite of these two dimensions, with basically a plane of inertia in between or an event horizon between. Like I said, this is your white hole. This is everything that you see. This is visible matter. This is your black hole. This is everything that you can't see. This is counter space. This is below the visible light spectrum. See, the visible light spectrum would start right here if you were climbing up. So the higher the frequency, the higher the frequency, the higher the frequency, until it gets so high that it dumps back into counter space. And this is always occurring. So that's why this system here is always self-sustaining, because it powers itself. So that's what's happening. That's how they're jumping the plane. They're creating these transients. And what does that look like? It starts to go pyramidal. So when they get the energy high enough, and what they were showing in the video is these orbs that they're spinning around the plane. So they're charging up the air in the local area. So the video shows these 3 orbs and they're in a triangular pattern, and then they start swirling. So they're changing that spot, and that's how they jumped it. I never witnessed any orbs because it was during the daytime when these jets were doing their maneuvers, and I never witnessed any kind of orbs like that. But I've witnessed plenty of orbs in the area that are UFOs, and that's how they apparently were jumping this thing. So it's just basically using these principles that Tesla and all these guys come up with. Steinmetz, Alexanderson, Marconi, they all came up with this stuff, and then it went underground. As soon as they hit the point to where they were able to possibly jump something into another dimension, it all went underground, and they threw everybody the electron and Einstein, and everybody bought it. Well, I'm here to defool everybody. It's no different than this guy that had just come out a while ago. I guess he come out in maybe 2016. He come back or whatever. So I guess it's been a minute, but his name is Mike Merkham, and they call him Madman Mike, and he was on Art Bell. Well, I just heard about this guy recently, and he's supposedly a time traveler because he built something to where he was using a Jacob's ladder. He was just taking 2 pieces of coat hanger at first, and he was just making the spark jump, and then the spark will rise up to the top, and then it'll fall back down and keep climbing because everything climbs to a positive charge. So he was messing around with this thing and kept building bigger and bigger ones. Well, he built one big enough to where he threw a screw through the field, and the screw disappeared, and then it reappeared about a half a second later in another spot. So he kept ramping up his testing and throwing bigger things through it. But basically he's doing the same exact thing, to where he's just setting up this potential for this to happen, and then just running it between these 2 points in the field to where it's the strongest. So that's what's going on. That's how they're doing it. These videos are just completely confirming everything that I said, and that's how they're doing it for sure. So thanks for watching. I'm gonna try and upload some more videos here, and I appreciate it. Thanks.